So, welcome back to Silmarillion Total War and to another battle replay on a map called FALAS, which is rather interesting. Now you may notice as well that this is a somewhat smaller scale battle replay and slightly lower on the frame count, and that's because I'm going to be recording this midweek, and if I'm going to be recording something in midweek, given my current schedule, I really don't want it to be a Leviathan battle replay on a map like Merlond, which I do still have to do, but I'll save that for the coming weekend, I think. And I did want to record something because I really want to get as far ahead on recording as I possibly can ahead of the new year coming in, and I feel as though this one will actually probably release after the new year at some point. Anyway, regardless, this is also going to be without one of the both of the two new factions, all new factions anyway, in the most recent patch of the game, that being the Avari of Torim Doriath and the Horrors of Nandan Gorthab, but it will have what I believe will be, going forward, one of the fan favourite factions in Silmarillion just because of their nature, which is Valinor, and they're going to be over here played by Alexander 10Q, who sent me this battle replay, so big thank you to him. It was part of a bunch of battle replays, including, I believe, the most recent one we did on Silmarillion, which was the debut of the Horrors of Nandan Gorthab, so big thank you to him, because his supply is going to be keeping me going for a little while with Silmarillion at the very least, although most of the battle replays for Silmarillion that I do get given are more sort of showcase battles, because new patches have been flowing, or at least they were back in late November, so that was mainly the purpose behind sending me all of these. But it would also be quite neat as well to see a large set piece battle at some point in Silmarillion to really showcase what the game, or what their work can do there, to get my words correct. But regardless, because these are all factions we've seen before, it also shouldn't take quite so long to go through each individual faction, because there aren't quite so many on the field. We also won't have to go through, it won't be like a 20-minute introduction like I normally do with Silmarillion, because every time I usually do Silmarillion there's been new patches that have come out, but thankfully, because of the supply of replays I've been given now, that may not actually be the case, and I'll be able to get some more regular Silmarillion stuff out, but we shall see. Valinor, it looks as though as well, just having a cursory glance over his army, he has gone quite heavily into the Teleri units again, the more basic, lighter unit of elves that live on the coasts of Valinor itself. That's kind of by necessity, because you can't, if you only brought Valinor's most elite units, your army would be tiny and probably swallowed whole by the units that, the armies that will be coming at you from the other side of the field. So leaning on these Teleri auxiliaries, for lack of a better term, is going to be a good idea. And let's not forget as well that the Teleri themselves are also perfectly capable of looking after themselves in their various vocations. Speaking of which, the Sentries of Alqualonde, which are a perfectly damaging unit of archers. Now they do stumble a little bit in terms of their armour values when it comes to skirmishing with the enemy. There are certainly elven factions which can do that better, so a stand and shoot style doesn't really suit Valinor, but the extra damage that a unit like this can offer in support of your very powerful infantry is also very good. We've seen in the past as well, when the Easterlings were completely without a foot archer, what that can do to hamstring a faction. So having a unit like this in support is going to be something you see most Valinor armies bring, I believe. Then just in behind we have the Grieving Sons, which are the strongest of the Teleri units in terms of their melee abilities, certainly in terms of their damage dealing. A two-handed heavy swordsman, and they're more of a medium unit than the other Teleri units perhaps could be viewed as. But yeah, a decent unit of elven heavy swordsmen this, and they are going to be in and amongst a lot of Swan Guard of Alqualonde, which make for a good entry-level spear unit as well. So as far as the front line goes, you're really covering all your bases. A numerous defensive unit with a slightly higher tier but more damaging unit in and amongst them as well. So plenty of good potential here for cost effectiveness. Meanwhile, moving further back into the trees, we have some Mariners of Alqualonde. We've seen them before, of course, as well. A unit of Teleri Javelins, these sort of supporting tools, the ranged units that Valinor does have in their Teleri units, very useful for supporting their infantry. And of course, once you do get up close and personal as Valinor, which is what you certainly want to be doing, the Mariners of Alqualonde can also offer some invaluable support when you get into close range, as of course can the Shoal Hunters of Alqualonde. They don't have very much high base damage, but they are armour piercing, as with any other unit of slingers in the game, including the examples from Gondolin and the Avari. So again, another nice supporting tool, and they're half decent in melee as well, as you would expect most Valinor units to be. But let's not forget the fact that Valinor's true identity comes from their really high tier elite units, and we have a couple of units on the flank here of Peacekeepers of Valimar. But an armour piercing unit of spears this, so a very, very dangerous unit indeed, multiple HP as well. All around they're just really, really good. If there was a potential gap in their defences, that they are technically medium infantry, so their armour values are not as high as some of the other units that Valinor have, but they do make up for that by the extra melee defensive values that spears often have because of their faster attacking rate, and the armour piercing on those spears as well offers them a really useful tool for dealing with enemy heavily armoured units. So a really good all-rounder this, definitely approve of their inclusion in most Valinor armies. A couple of units of Knights of Tyrion, we've seen them be very effective in the past as well for Valinor, very effective unit of melee cavalry as you would expect. We've seen them more often actually used since their inclusion as a unit of makeshift shot cavalry charging into the enemy because they're so robust that it's really difficult to kill them if you keep them moving in that respect. But we'll see what the armies across them want to do with them, because if you do want to try and bring down the Knights of Tyrion, it's easier said than done because you can't use your own cavalry, but what do you do other than that? Do you just keep a tight formation and hope they skewer themselves on your spears? And finally, the Kinsmen of Ingwe, a unit of bodyguard tier line infantry for Valinor with their general in it, of course. And of course, to qualify as a bodyguard tier unit for Valinor, it says something about how tanky you're going to have to be. But other than that, they're relatively unremarkable in what they do, they're just very good at it. Valinor's allies for today, that's more of Valinor's army, but they are going to be Doriath, played by Stewie. Doriath themselves are certainly more of an attack-focused faction in terms of their outright damage-dealing potential, but they're certainly not going to be as durable as a lot of the Valinor units that are next to them. But they do have that same split between lighter units. For the forces of Valinor, it's the Teleri. For Doriath, it is their girdle units. Spear hosts of the girdle are javelins, and then they pull out their spears in melee. Poison javelins as well, which is interesting and unique. So the damage they do is also backed up by the morale shocks that they can potentially inflict. Axemen of the girdle, higher base damage. Certainly we all know how devastating axe throwers can be, and they have plenty of axes on them as well, the Axemen of the girdle. You only have to look at them to see that. The axe, certainly the weapon of choice for Doriath, and indeed the warriors of Regi and back here, a unit of heavy axemen, which are few and far between actually for the elves, so it is something Doriath can certainly leverage against their foes. Very useful unit to have. Speaking of which, we have the Cuthalim as well, which is where High King Thingol is going to be. Again, another unit which has got that armour-piercing edge to it with their armour-piercing missiles. A very small unit, but also very adept in melee. Really, they're just a fantastic all-round unit. The problem is their expense and their size. So that is worth bearing in mind as the battle goes along. Will they be able to maintain their effectiveness? The Sword Host of Regian, a unit of nice, heavier line infantry. They don't really match up to the same level of survivability as some of the other elven line infantry, such as from Feanor, Valinor, their ally today, and the like, but still very good, and also they have that slight edge towards damage dealing that most Doriath units are going to have. Spear Host of the Girdle, once again Warriors of Regian and Axemen of Girdle here on the flank, and he also has a force even further out wide of Marksmen of Regian, so a unit of heavier archers with those Silverthorn arrows, Rangers of the Girdle with their poison arrows, and also some standard Axe Guard of Regian. So you can see which units don't have the armour upgrade and which do. This one doesn't, of course. They've got a lighter look to them. I think I actually prefer the unupgraded model actually for Doriath though, which is kind of interesting. It fits their faction I think a little bit more, and it gets across the point that they aren't going to be quite as robust as some of the other elven factions. But yeah, a couple of units of nice Axeman line infantry, just in case the enemy does decide to try and engage this little flanking force. They have some infantry ready to meet any potential advances. So the first of the red team going to be Tundra's Fox, playing as the Falathrim. Interestingly enough, they have also had a bit of a makeover, and it's one that I approve of in terms of the Seafarers of Brythonbar here. Once again, they've got much more of a sort of leathery look to them now. They are the Macemen, so they're relatively light Macemen, so I've said this before, if you send them up against a unit of heavy swordsmen that have got a lot of heavy armour, yes, their armour piercing is going to be useful, but they themselves are not going to be able to withstand the sheer amount of damage that is coming towards them. So they work much better in a combined arms approach, which is kind of what the Falathrim do very well anyway, so it should go without saying. But even so, the Macemen will be useful against some of the heavier Doriath units, certainly against the heavier Valinor units, but like I said, they're going to need support, because otherwise in both cases they're going to find themselves outclassed. Some Rangers of Brythonbar over here, small units, but still, we'll see how this goes. Lighter units from the Falathrim may not do quite as well in a skirmish fight with Doriath, but what certainly will be stuff like the Marksmen of Balar. Once again, we're seeing a little bit more of a makeover for them as well. Very effective unit of heavy elven archers this, and they're going to be very happy at skirmishing with either Valinor or Doriath, to be honest. Even against the Marksmen of Regian, the Silverthorn arrows may knock them about a bit, but their heavier armour will win the day in that particular case. Just in behind them, Warriors of Aglarest, a good unit of medium line infantry this, so it'll be quite interesting to see who comes out on top between themselves and Doriath. Doriath you'd give a slight edge in a straight fight because of their extra bit of damage that they can deal, and the armor piercing they have will be useful, but when you're talking about units of the sheer quality like the Aran-Kia-Lim here, very good unit of heavy elven line infantry indeed. Seafarer's a Brythonbar as well, so he is going for the mixed approach here, Tundra's Fox, which is good to see. Very wide though. He could end up attracting the ire of both of his opponents if they so choose. In here we've got some Spearmen of Brythonbar, which of course have got their javelins, very similar to the kind of javelins that we're seeing from Doriath as well, only they don't have the poison effect on them. Just in behind, a really good unit of supporting infantry as well, the Mariners of Erendil, very similar to the Warriors of Eglarest, only a little bit better in every sense, and they've got a few little bits and pieces as well, like they can inspire nearby units, and also they've got a slight anti-elephant bonus as well, so against monstrous units they're going to be a little bit more effective. Just all around they're slightly better as a supporting tool and an anchor to your line, if you will, but they are also more expensive to complement that. Catapult, so very eager on making the enemy advance towards them, which is not the worst idea, because advancing into a pincer movement from Doriath and Valinor would be very painful for a faction that's relying clearly on a lot more of their lighter units, like the Falathrim are here. They may have a few units that are hidden, but not all that many, because there's quite a lot, and they have got some Noldor heavy units as well, and it's the ones that are slower burn units as well, like the heavier archers and the Aran-Kia-Lim, which are more defensive infantry by nature. And they are going to be joined by General Artorius today, who's going to be playing as the Easterlings, got some Warband of Lothlin, some Wardens of Lothlin, and in amongst there as well, the only true phalanx unit that we're seeing on the field today, the Halberdiers of Lothlin. Could that be absolutely vital in securing the red team's victory? We shall have to wait and see. Plenty of Halberdiers though, and I do agree with this decision. It allows you to keep some of the really scary stuff from Doriath and especially Valinor at arm's length, not only with that range but also with a bit of armor piercing as well, which will be useful against both. We've also got some Clan Guard of Lothlin and some Amberone Honour Guard in here as well, so a good doubling up here of the line infantry units, including the bodyguard tier unit, so again, nice second wave to help reinforce that line should it be needed. They have got the Fangs of the Faithless, which are obviously going to be fairly comfortable in a skirmish fight. Can they deal with the superior numbers of the Teleri archers or the Silverthorns of Doriath? We'll have to wait and see on that one. I mean, it's standing and shooting is not really the Easterlings' forte, because they can only bring one of these units after all before it becomes extortionately expensive, so we'll have to wait and see. More spears, so plenty of infantry here. They've certainly gone for a numbers-focused infantry approach, which I actually think is the right idea, especially when you consider that's kind of what the Falathrim have done as well, so certainly a more numerous army here for the red team, but I think their composition is pretty good. We'll see how well they can utilise it. A couple of units of Wardens of Lothlin as well. Also a much heavier look to this Easterling army than we've seen from them in recent replays on Silmarillion. Most of the time we've seen them recently, after all, we've seen a pretty hefty Falksman and throwing projectile contingent. That's not going to be the case this time, a much more straightforward army, but I think that could work in their favour if the Halberdiers can lay down their effectiveness and keep factions like Valinor at arm's length. But we shall have to wait and see who will claim ownership over these ruins in this fight. Without further ado, let's begin, shall we? I realise now, of course, that the replay name FALAS Círdan simply refers to the fact that the Falathrim and their general Círdan are on the field and not the actual map itself, but I'm so used to people sending me replays where the file name is the name of the map or the location they're in, but I kind of went onto autopilot there, but no worries, I'm sure that there is an appropriate name that we can think of for these ruins. Regardless, you can see here the artillery is hitting with... For a while there was actually no sound effects on the hits that missed, which is a little bit strange, but they do manage to get a few kills on the spear host of the girdle here at the front, which will be important. And as much as the Falathrim maybe aren't as vulnerable to the kind of armour piercing that Doriath can be very good at laying down, I would also say that Doriath are just good at getting those damage values across in general, and that's where the lighter units, like the Brythonbar units in particular, are going to maybe come unstuck a little bit. See, there's a Brythonbar looking much better, I have to say, in this style than they used to. There was something rather comic book-esque about them before, given their helmets and general colour schemes, but this is a little bit more angular, a little bit sleeker. I definitely approve of that. Meanwhile, we do have some Clan Guard of Lothlin moving forward here, and they will occupy the central ruins. Does offer them a little bit of cover. Obviously they have the artillery advantage as well, given the fact that they can bombard the enemy, and the Easterlings are also going to move across to help reinforce the Falathrim. They will be fighting together, which I do think is the right call. Isolating one-on-one is probably not the best idea, even with the heavier units that the Easterlings have. You wouldn't really want to go blow for blow with Valinor alone unless you absolutely had to. And as I just mentioned, Doriath's damage values could be exactly the sort of thing that could cause quite a few problems for the Falathrim unless Tundra's Fox manages to organise his army just so. That is the key to any Falathrim war effort. Now then, what are they going to be going after with this artillery? Try and hit maybe some of the Valinor units. They do manage to... I mean, they're going to hit units over here simply because they cover a lot of surface area. Not going to get many kills per hit though. Mariners of Alqualonde, Javelins... I mean, it's better than getting no kills at all. But it's definitely not going to be decisive actions, and of course that ammunition is, proportionally speaking, quite expensive to utilise. Knights of Tyrion going to be moving forward here on the flank to the area that the Easterlings have recently vacated. Neither side seems to be too eager on actually posting up in the actual ruins themselves, which does offer a little bit of cover. If anything, Valinor could advance forward and it'll offer them at least a little bit of a screen against the catapult fire, and then later when they get a little bit closer, any sort of arrow fire that can be thrown forth from the Marksmen of Balar, and somewhere around here, yes, the Fangs of the Faithless also are waiting. Slowly but surely, Doriath are edging forward. Now, over there you can also see some projectiles being spewed forth, these Silverthorn arrows. Getting some initial damage done to only the most basic of Easterling units though in the Warband of Lothland. It will make moving a little bit more difficult when you're taking Silverthorn fire because it sends your units, knocks them over. Clan Guard of Lothland now also getting hit, but like I said, with this kind of Easterling army they are significantly bulkier than the builds we've seen more recently from the Easterlings, and that should make them much more resilient to this sort of thing. They're certainly not going to rout initially from the poison arrows, not very quickly anyway, and the Silverthorns, it'll make the advance a little bit more punishing and longer, but it won't be crippling in the way that it perhaps could have been. I mean, it looks very intimidating, but the Easterlings have got just about as good an army as they can expect to have against this sort of thing. But Stewie gonna stand and shoot for now. The Easterlings probably have more numbers in melee, and they're gonna have to rely on their damage values to maybe see them weather the storm. The Easterlings still intent on moving forward. There are these javelin men in the tree line, of course, and they will be trying to use more poison projectiles. I mean, the Warband, if they do continue to take tons and tons of damage, may be tempted to rout. Let's see what's happening over here. Meanwhile, Marksmen of Balar now firing into the sentries of Alqualonde. This is definitely the kind of straight-up skirmish fight you would imagine would favour the Falathrim because of those heavy Noldor elves going to be able to withstand a lot more punishment than the lighter Teleri. So I'm a little bit surprised, honestly, that Alexander has decided to take this approach, but I suppose he has 3 units of archers, whereas the Falathrim only have the 2. You need to be a little bit careful with these Knights of Tyrion as well, where if they go charging in, things could get a little bit messy. They are only melee cavalry, but they're so tanky that you're not going to be able to kill them very easily on the approach at all, although he does pull out of that charge in the end. You can see over here, Outriders of the Girdle trying to charge in. I mean, it's a little bit risky to maybe do that, given the presence of all the halberdiers and all of the spearmen that the Easterlings do have at their disposal. I mean, the Easterlings at this point have committed forward. They are going to need to get stuck in. They have managed to catch out the spear host of the Girdle while Stewie was microing his cavalry, but that's fine because they do have the Axemen in behind as well, which they can utilise to do a fair amount of damage, getting some friendly fire there as well. But clearly the main target for all of these ranged Doriath efforts are going to be the halberdiers, which the Easterling push is going to be based largely around. The spear host of the Girdle taking a lot of damage. Now we're going to see a charge forwards. I think actually what we're going to do is go into half speed. They are actually not going to engage right away, perhaps because they know the Warband of Lothland will get cut to pieces by Sword Hosts of Regin, so they're going to need a little bit of backup before they do that. The heavier Lothland units will do it a little bit better. They're going to try and go around the flank. Axguard of Regin is one unit that you would be a little bit concerned about, that base damage very high. And then perhaps also any heavy axemen that they perceive as well. I mean, Halberdiers of Lothland getting a little bit further ahead of the Warband here can be a little bit difficult to move your army in exactly the way you want when you're having to coordinate an entire push, but it's this sort of thing which Doriath can take advantage of now. killing off more of those halberdiers. Sword Host of Region holding the front line, but with the halberdiers there, Doriath will need to affect this fight in some way, otherwise the sheer weight of numbers as well as that phalanx that the Easterlings are bringing to the table will be far too much. Meanwhile, over here, Knights of Tyrion do charge forward into the Spearmen of Brythonbar, who are acting as a sort of shield here on the front. Forward come the Scouts of Eglores. Decent melee cavalry, the Scouts of Eglores, but I mean, you're talking about two very different levels of cavalry here. The Knights of Tyrion will be absolutely fine in going after the Scouts, and they do turn around in the end. I mean, perhaps what they want to do is blob the Knights of Tyrion up so that their rangers and their javelins in behind can start to try and equal the fight, but this is where the sheer quality of Valinor's units should start to really pay some dividends. There's another unit of Scouts of Eglores in there as well, but so far it is very much that game of cat and mouse, trading back and forth with their various skirmishers and trying to get potshot charges with their cavalry on both sides. More so the aggressors from that perspective are Valinor, but it's kind of a necessity that that is the case as well, purely because surely the skirmish advantage is in the Falathrim's favour. Spearmen of Brythonbar pushing back against the Knights of Tyrion. The addition of Spearmen would make that less of an attractive fight for the Knights of Tyrion to take. Halberdiers of Lothland doing their thing. Warband of Lothland ready to move in and support if necessary. Axemen of the Girdle moving into melee. The Halberdiers already making life pretty difficult for Doriath on the front line. The Warriors of Region, exactly the sort of thing which will be really useful against the Lothland units. That armour piercing will certainly not be wasted here. I felt as if they would have to try and go up against the Falathrim, but they'll be much happier about the fact that they're going up against the Easterlings, given the army they're facing. Halberdiers continuing to be a problem though. I mean, the Marksmen of Region may be trying to get some point blank shots. Also, the fact that units are starting to spill around these lines over here is another bad sign for Doriath. They're going to need more units over here. They've got some reinforcements down there, as you can see, but they're almost acting as a ward against any Falathrim aggression as well. Axguard of Region trying to overload this flank and having some success. They'll be really good at wiping through the Wardens of Lothland. Heavier armour of the Clan Guard will help them in that regard, however. And more reinforcements also on the way. Another unit of Wardens of Lothland, maybe not the sort of thing which will deal the kind of damage in return that the Eastlings will want, but it will at least make it so the front line will be shored up for now, and it will give Artorius the time he needs to maybe break through in other areas. Seafarers of Brythonbar on the way up. Outriders of the Girdle making a nuisance of themselves here in the backfield, so Sturi doing good work with his cavalry, but that sort of damage is pretty impressive. I like the updated model on the Outriders of the Girdle as well. I mean, they are shaken. Warband of Lothland here in the reserve. A couple of units of them guarding the rear, and those spears will be the sort of thing that the Outriders need to guard against. Meanwhile, still no immediate push forward. Rangers of Brythonbar over here on the flank, shooting into some sentries of Aquilonde. I mean, they certainly aren't the skirmishing archer that the Marksmen of Balar are, but it will allow them to get more volume of arrows downrange and try and answer the damage that they're taking at the hands of those cavalry charges. Going after the Seafarers, I mean, they are shielded, but they are lightly armoured in the way that the Brythonbar units are, so you can see they are taking damage at the hands of the Teleri arrow fire, and perhaps they are respecting the fact that they are macemen. That armour piercing is certainly not going to be useless as the battle goes on. Well, Axemen of the Girdle defeat still seems almost like a certainty. As I mentioned earlier, Doriath and the Falathrim do have that split between their sort of lighter units, which are more skirmishy and support based, and then the heavier units, although there's more of an emphasis on the lighter supporting units for the Falathrim, I think, whereas the Doriath units, you're going to see more of their heavier stuff, and they're also more damage focused in melee, whereas when you get up to the upper end of the Falathrim, a little bit more focused around being survivable and heavily armoured, stuff like the Iran Kielim, which we may yet see. Halberdiers of Lothland still proving to be a problem, however. You can see that these Axemen, they would be really useful if they could get into clear melee range with the Halberdiers, but being kept at arm's length like this is going to be a bit of a problem for them. Warriors of Region are starting to surround them, however that's how they can get into melee with them. And it's been a very back and forth fight. The Cuthalin, who perhaps have utilised all their ammunition already, getting into melee. I mean, there's only 33 of them, but they will offer really good support on this front line. And especially against stuff like Warband of Lothland, they'll be so dominant that it won't go all that well the Easterlings there. Still though, the Easterlings now actually counteracting the flanking move that all these Axe Guard of Region had. The Clan Guard of Lothland pinning them in place. They still have a spare unit of Warband which they can get around here and prevent these Marks of Region from firing. They would lose that fight with Warband, but it's better than allowing the Silverthorns to rip right up the Easterling front line, you'd have to say. And then there's still the Ambarona Honour Guard who can be committed in much the same way as the Cuthalim have already been committed for Doriath. Well, we are starting to see these lines get a little bit closer together now, and in fact the Falathrim getting into place, ready to move forward, with more of the Doriath units having to be committed over to stop Eastling advance. It is going to be much more of two separate 1v1s with a few supporting units from both sides doing their thing as well. Seafarers of Brythonmar moving in, but I don't think Valinor will be too worried about that. The Grieving Sons are in here, the Alcolonde units probably make for the least effective target for the Seafarers. The presence of the Arankir Limb will be a little bit more of a concern, but the Peacekeepers of Valinor are in here, and that armour-piercing damage is exactly the sort of thing you need to be seeing against a unit like the Arankir Limb. And I would say Valinor are probably in a better position over here. Warriors of Eglares make for a pretty good middle ground between those two units we've already seen. They'll certainly withstand the damage of the Grieving Sons a little bit better, but still, I'd say Valinor's front line is maybe a little bit more well put together in this sort of situation, and reinforcements not yet forthcoming from these units of Seafarers. This unit of Sentries of Alcolonde moving forward, and it's a battle between two light archers. The Alcolonde ones greater in number and I think are the better in melee, not that it's either of these two units' main focus. There's still cavalry being a real nuisance here in the backfield. These Outriders of the Girdle have gotten a lot of value off so far. Doriath's front line, it's still unclear who's really going to come out on top between Doriath and the Easterlings there. Oof, that was pretty brutal from the Mariners. Several of those Seafarers will get back up, but still, can't really afford for your reserve line to be taking this much of a beating from javelins from the front, cavalry from the rear. And the Falathrim could be in a little bit of trouble here, because I don't fancy their chances in that initial engagement they've taken against Valinor. They're going to need reinforcements, and if they continue to take damage like this, it's going to be pretty grisly for them. The cavalry advantage, most certainly with the blue team here. The Knights of Tyrion now tagging the catapult, another bad sign here for the Falathrim. They need this catapult to get more value off than it already has done. Scouts of Eglares are over here. They could try and intercept the Knights of Tyrion, but realistically they would lose that fight anyway. Mariners at Verendil moving forward, the Easterlings starting to wrap around. I think with how good it's looking for Valinor from the off here, they're going to have to rely on the fact they can beat Doriath, and then maybe reinforcements from the Easterlings can come in to try and help double up on Valinor. The Kinsmen of Ingwe going to be too strong for the Seafarers. As I said, we've seen the Seafarers actually taking 1v1 fights, but as I mentioned in the composition phase, they're much better as part of a combined arms approach to supporting unit of light infantry, more so than a unit of pure infantry that can hold the line all on their own. This is a little bit more like it when you add a tankier unit like the Wardens of Lothland to them. It becomes a bit of a different prospect, but has the damage already been done, you would have to ask. Warriors of Region doing quite well. They've surrounded this unit of Halberdiers, and this is a problem because there's now going to be a big old hole in the Easterling lines. Fangs of the Faithless doing their best to get some damage done, but the Kinsmen of Ingwe are actually one of the more resilient units, so perhaps the ammunition not being as well utilised as it could have been. The Halberdiers are doing a pretty good job at keeping the Cuthalim at bay, but even here, maybe it's not quite as simple as all that. And the Halberdiers, and any phalanx unit in general, is going to be a slower method of winning a melee fight. So while, if this fight continued for a long period of time, the Easterlings would win the direct frontline fight, I can't help but feel like the battle in other places is going to go against the red team fairly significantly. And as a result, they may be staring down the barrel of a defeat anyway, but we'll see. There's still plenty that can happen between now and the end of the fight. The Marksmen of Region, as I anticipated, the Warband of Lothland have interrupted them. The Marksmen will win this fight, but as I said, it was kind of a necessity. You need to stop the Marksmen from shooting their shots right up your front line, otherwise the victories that you are sort of experiencing will start to evaporate. And this is the problem I was slightly concerned about. Now there is a gap in the line, the Warriors of Region charging on through, and they will now prevent the Fangs of the Faithless from shooting in as well. And as I mentioned, Fangs of the Faithless look like they'll be more impressive in melee than they actually are. I mean, they can defend themselves reasonably enough, like they're a decently defensive unit, but they're not going to do a lot of damage in return. saving grace here might be that Doriath have taken damage as a result of busting through that front line, so maybe all is not lost. Meanwhile, Marksmen of Balar shooting away, Mariners of Erendil, they have managed to salvage the catapult, which is something, even though this cavalry is still making a real nuisance of itself. Warrior Scouts of Eglarest are here, Spearmen of Brythombar on the front line, and more Teleri, Mariners of Alqualonde moving forward. These Rangers of Brythombar surely going to be destroyed at this point. This advanced front line from the Falathrim. I mean, the Warriors of Eglarest will do quite well against the Teleri units, other than maybe the Grieving Sons, but Peacekeepers of Valinor here. The strongest unit of infantry the Falathrim have fielded here in the Arankir Lim. There's only so much they're going to be capable of doing in this kind of fight. Still some missiles from the sentries of Alqualonde as well. You can see here the Seafarers really are struggling. They're all on their own in several positions. Here it's a bit different where they've got the Arankir Lim to back them up, but the Valinor front line was a combined arms approach from the start. I mean, most of these are spearmen, but at least one of them is an armour-piercing spear. Kinsmen of Ingwe there, looking like they're under some pretty severe pressure, and the Valinor general does fall away, but naturally the Valinor morale is such that that's not going to be too much of a problem as long as they maintain their what looks to be a slow burn of a victory elsewhere. They're going to be in no real danger of routing. Kinsmen of Ingwe as well. Defeat is a distinct possibility. I mean, they are being overwhelmed at this point through sheer numbers, and the addition over here as well of these Warriors of Eglarest is making it so that the gap that has appeared in the line isn't quite as devastating as it could have been, as Doriath could have made it. And Spear Host of the Girdle, I mean, I wouldn't fancy their chances in normal circumstances against the Warriors of Eglarest, but Warriors of Ragian are here. There's not too many of those Warband of Lothland left, and they look like they're going to rout. Meanwhile, this offensive action from the Warriors of Ragian, victory seems certain. You can see here the Fangs of the Faithless showcasing their shortcomings in melee a little bit, because these are not the most healthy of Doriath units and they're still winning. Meanwhile, the Warband of Lothland trying to prevent this flanking move, but I mean, the Warband of Lothland have done exactly what you would ask of them really in this battle. They are the lowest tier of Easterling infantry, but they've been asked to plug gaps and close the gap to enemies on occasions and just be getting in the way of Doriath. They've done that, but ultimately that's all they can do, and eventually they've mostly been in fights they've been doomed to lose in this battle so far. Cuthalim, Panzer forces is evenly matched. Here on this front line, this is where the red team will be really hoping that the battle can turn a little bit in their favour, because they are winning and the Halberdiers are having the kind of effect that they would want to, and at this point there's only a very thin line of Rangers of the Girdle stopping the Eastlings from doing exactly the same thing Doriath did to them on the flank and just blowing the centre of their line wide open. The Axemen of the Girdle, I think, see this, and at this point they're going to try and get in behind the Halberdiers to at least try and prevent that from happening. But even here on the flanking position, Shoal Hunters of Alqualonde trying to get into place, 2 units of them. Those slingers could be exactly the sort of thing to shoot into this big blob of Eastlings over here, which is exactly what's going to be happening, because initially what began fairly promisingly for the Axeguard of Regian has turned against them because of the sheer numbers the Eastlings committed to this fight. And yeah, Halberdiers over here as well, but with those slingers firing in, might be a little bit different. Warband of Lothland turning around, Knights of Tyrion getting in here now. Going to try and help turn this fight around. They have taken damage over the course of the battle, but such a tanky unit that Warriors of Regian coming in, they're just going to have to set up a new front line, Eastling, so it's not going to be quite the victory they would have hoped for. Good response there from the blue team. Spear Host of the Girdle slowly losing against the Warriors of Eglarest. The Mariners of Erendil are here. Catapult being utilised, a little bit of friendly fire, but this fight is already a lost cause from the Falathrim perspectives. They want to fire in here, and certainly the Peacekeepers of Valinor are one of those units that you want to try and get rid of at this point. Can't allow them to be the melee powerhouse that they have been so far. Swanguard of Alqualonde finishing off this ever-decreasing number of Warriors of Eglarest. And over here a lot more Teleri as well. Yeah, the engagements as they have been down here have definitely been, right from the off, they looked more favourable to Valinor, and so it has turned out to be. Too many of the Falathrim units were isolated one-on-one against Valinor units which were more well organised, and just generally speaking, that is exactly the opposite of what you want to be happening as a Falathrim army. Marksmen of Balar forming up a secondary front line, preventing further advances from the Valinor infantry pulling out their two-handed swords. Meanwhile, Easterlings getting in behind enemy lines, a unit of Wardens of Lothland. They do have plenty of opportunities here to use that catapult, but they're going to need to hope that they get some fortuitous hits. Otherwise this could all work against them anyway. Not the most vicious of charges there from the Wardens of Lothland, but they do manage to surround this front line. With Lim over on the other side, this could be another important victory for the red team here. The Mariners of Eärendil, I mean, they're a good quality unit. They're not on the same level as the Kinsmen of Ingwe, but considering the damage they've already taken, that should be enough. 6 Spear Host of the Girdle. At this point, everyone still needs to play their part. Axemen of the Girdle are over here as well. There's still Knights of Tyrion. Should be enough to finish off those Spearmen of Brythombar, and the Axemen of the Girdle may now go to the aid of the Kinsmen of Ingwe. Warriors of Raggian turning back around, but they're too depleted at this point to overcome this unit of Warriors of Eglarest, I would suggest. Are things going well for the Easterlings still over here? Have they managed to reorganise? I don't know, the Shoal Hunters look to have done a good amount of damage over here. There's still enough Lothland units to be maybe a bit of a problem, but now that the Shoal Hunters are in melee as well, the Easterlings may actually end up losing this engagement. Most unfortunate for them. 1 Scout of Eglarest remains. And there he goes. Marksmen of Raggian going to get into another position. Yeah, I'd say now with a full surround, I mean, Shoal Hunters of Alqualonde, much like any of the other Teleri, are going to be somewhat fragile, but yeah, completely surrounded as they are, that's a big setback for the Easterlings, and that may be a fairly decisive moment. There's also more arrow fire coming in now. This fight that could have been going their way with the addition of those halberdiers is surely going to turn against them now, if those Marksmen of Raggian continue to fire into them, because I can't see how the red team can fully turn this around without a solid core of those Easterling halberds alive in the late game. There is the Doriath general right in amongst things. I don't know if Thingol is going to be able to get out of here. Now, what have we going on over here? Kinsmen of Ingwe, 10 of them remain. Axemen of the Girdle not going to last too long against the kind of units they're being asked to try and deal with. Lim, the assistance of those Easterlings. Red team have more of an opportunity to try and make something happen over here, but in come the Grieving Sons, and they'll be exactly the sort of thing that will be really good for dealing with the Seafarers of Brythombar. Again, just these little engagements, it's going to get harder and harder for the red team to turn this fight in their favour, given the fact that Valinor still have a lot of these peacekeepers up and about. There's still a lot of these Teleri over here as well. They're just running out of units to be able to cover every angle. Doriath general. So both blue team generals have fallen before the red team generals. Could be a little bit more of a problem for Doriath, given the fact that some of their units are already on the verge of routing, and either weren't are now also going to take another morale hit. But I think these fights are going in their favour enough that it shouldn't be too much of a problem. Marksmen of Raggian out of ammo, so getting into melee. There's still the Amberona Honour Guard, there's still 43 of them as well. I mean, they're a very tanky unit, going to be difficult to mulch your way through them. And without any ammunition, support of halberdiers. In Doriath, they can do a lot of damage here, but I think the Easterlings would actually still come out on top of this fight just about, but it would be a highly Pyrrhic victory, and I'm not sure whether it's going to be enough to turn the battle around on the other side. There's still some Shoal Hunters that could surround that position as well and kill off yet more of those valuable halberds. Let's not forget the cavalry advantage still also belongs to the blue team as well. Not that there's too much of it left, but it is still a useful tool for hitting the enemy where it hurts in the late game. Speaking of which, we'll probably struggle to rout the Lim off a charge, but they are giving it a good go anyway. Probably need to get out of there and recycle that charge when the Grieving Sons over here. It was a good surround from the Warband, or Wardens of Lothland I should say, but simply not enough, and Valinor are going to be fairly handily victorious against the Falathrim over on this side of the map, I fancy. Knights of Tyrion waddling away, the Mariners of Eärendil still alive, 34 of them. It's not going to be enough to withstand the onslaught that is to come and overcome. A lot of Shoal Hunters still alive. Support. And, I mean, they are armour piercing as well in melee with those clubs, maces. And that's exactly the sort of thing which will be useful against the surviving Amberona Honor Guard. Warriors of Region still just about alive. I mean, Doriath don't have all that much left on the field. I get the feeling the only faction with what could be considered an army by the end of this battle left will probably be Valinor. So this will have been the best performance we've seen from Valinor on a battle so far in Silmarillion since their introduction, but that's not really been their fault in the previous battles. It's just been difficult situations they've been put into. Victory seems certain. Only a fool could lose this battle. Grieving Sons, very useful unit. And there goes the Falathrim general. Should be enough to, yeah, send the rest of the Falathrim army into a full-blown rout. And that's the end of them. Mariners of Arendil gone. So now it will be this last stand of the Easterlings. And clearly the red team are going to lose at this point. It's just a matter of how many they can take with them before they fall. And the Valinor army, the rest of it, will be making its way over here. Not that, again, like, I really do think this unit of Marksmen of Region is the only unit from Doriath that remains. The Mariners of Alcalonde over there, a Valinor unit. No Outriders of the Girdle, who are also very well used, but they fizzled out much more quickly than the Knights of Tyrion, as you would expect. Outriders almost entirely focus on offense and speed. Knights of Tyrion, of course, significantly tankier. Grieving Sons making their way forward. I mean, the Peacekeepers of Valinor as well are going to be exactly the sort of thing which are going to be good against these Lothlin units. Not that being good against particular units is important at this point, because you can simply overwhelm what remains of them. At the very least, Stewie will remain standing, because his Marks of Region are not going to be killed to the last man before the Easterlings fall, so alive, but at what cost? You can see here, this is the number of Peacekeepers of Valinor that remain is perhaps the best indicator of what the Valinor elite infantry units can do, because they were out against, I mean, I think that the Falathrim attack could have been more organised, but they were still at melee for a long time, and they were ideal. Going up against the Brythonbar units, the Aran-Kielim, pretty much a perfect target for them with their armor piercing in a battle. They too are multiple HP, so you can still hear that galloping, so there's still some Knights of Tyrion left alive as well. This is going to be it. A very hotly contested battle that was. There was a bit of back and forth, but when the battle was fully underway, everyone was engaged. You always got the sense that Valinor and Doriath alliance was always in a slightly better position than their foe. And there we go. That is going to be that. Close one as well. Percentages are somewhat warped by the fact that the Valinor armies tend to be fairly small anyway. And you can see here, yeah, I mean, based on the number of kills, that's pretty much what you'd expect given the differences. Doriath doing very nicely, but then they were also going up against the biggest army on the field in the shape of the Easterlings. Bit of back and forth. And yeah, perhaps if, for the red team, what could have gone better, the catapult, you know, there's always a certain element of risk with bringing artillery, because it could go really well for you, could not do a great deal. On this occasion, got some decent hits, but not enough to justify its inclusion, and of course it did get harassed by that cavalry in the mid to late game as well. Needed a little bit more from that, and also needed, like I said, combined arms, very key for the Falathrim. They needed to be a little bit more organised, maybe a little bit more, maybe a tighter formation would have helped them as well against Valinor in this situation, because the Seafarers, absolutely, you want them there for their armour piercing, but not isolated against stuff like the Grieving Sons and any of the Teleri, really. They don't have the defensive values to be able to be that unit on their own, whereas if you combine them with other stuff in the Falathrim army, the Eglarest units that were on the field, the Aran-Kielim, maybe the addition of the Nobles of Balar. I mean, it's nice to see a Falathrim army without them, but I think having that Phalanx unit would have been really, really useful to keep stuff like those Peacekeepers of Valinor at bay. But again, it is what it is. They may well have won the initial skirmish, but the initial skirmish wasn't as impactful as I'm sure Hunter's Fox would have wanted it to be. The Easterlings, if it was down to a pure 1v1 against Doriath, I think Artorias would have had the beating of Stewie there. But in the end, it was a close fight regardless, and the Easterlings didn't win it by enough to make up for the Valinor momentum that was over on the other side. Speaking of which, let's see what did the damage for Valinor. Kinsmen of Ingwe doing pretty well in a fight that they were pretty much constantly on the back foot on. but then they are an incredibly tanky unit of line infantry. Peacekeepers of Valinor, I mean, those are good quality kills considering, you know, Aranki or Lim are going to be included in that. The Grieving Sons are a very useful unit in this kind of fight against the more lightly armoured elements of the Falathrim army, those Brithombai units, the ideal targets. Knights of Tyrion used very, very well. That's something else that you have to account for in this battle, the fact that the blue team utilised their cavalry really, really well, and they hit the red team where it hurts more than once, and that did prove to be a problem as it turned out. Good use of the Shoal Hunters as well to support his ally. In the end, it wasn't enough to completely save Doriath, but it did enough damage to the Easterlings that the battle was then never really in doubt. Mariners of Alqualonde, Sentries of Alqualonde, all the Teleri units doing a decent job at propping up the upper crust of Valinor society, as it were. So yeah, big thank you to Alexander 10Q for sending me this battle replay, and a big thank you to all the players for being a part of it as well. Always good to sprinkle in a couple of Silmarillion replays here and there. As I said, it would be neat to see sort of another large set-piece battle, as it were, in Silmarillion at some stage soon, because I don't think we've seen one of those with the new factions involved. So it'd be, I get the feeling that like maybe a Nandan Gorthab on the defence style sort of fight where they're sort of on their home terrain could be kind of interesting, because I feel like you could get fairly creative with what their home actually looks like. Not very homely, I would assume, for most other people. But yeah, that's the sort of thing which would be fairly neat to see in the future, but we'll wait and see. Silmarillion, of course, continues its development with a little bit more of a focus, sort of ever more focus really being placed onto a campaign. I believe the Naugrim and another faction of Elves are the only other two factions I know of that are in development. As soon as they are in, I think that would be the entirety of Silmarillion's faction lineup complete. So yeah, we'll keep an eye on that. We'll keep an eye on how development in that respect goes. I do have a couple more Silmarillion replays actually that I can do as well, which will probably be as we move into maybe later January and into February is when you'll maybe see the next one of those. For context, by the way, I'm actually recording this before Christmas in December. Yeah, I'm trying to record it ahead of time in a fairly extreme way, so it gives me a little bit of wiggle room with regards to some of the events which could happen in the early part of next year. And also over the Christmas period itself. So I'm really trying to stack my recording up now while I can, and having smaller replays like this that I can intersperse as well makes my job just that little bit easier at doing that. So that's another reason why we saw this one in particular at this moment. So yeah, I mean, I've already mentioned all of the stuff at this point in the Christmas update, and I'm sure I've already mentioned it to death on splash screens at the end of battles at this point with regards to what my intent is going to be moving through 2022. We shall see how everything pans out. But yeah, going to be an interesting year ahead, I think, both for Silmarillion and Reforged and for myself, I'm sure. But yeah, enough of my waffling. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.